Welcome to Train Signal. You are watching the video for Lab 1, Active Directory Domain. Now that you've installed Windows Server 2000 on the servers, it is time to configure it as a domain controller for our network. Even though this is an advanced Active Directory video, let's first go through the basics of what an Active Directory is and what the components of Active Directory are. So I'm going to do those two topics in the beginning of this video. Then we will go ahead and create a new domain called benandbrady.com, and DC1 will be the first domain controller for this domain. We will go ahead and install DC2 as the additional domain controller for the benandbrady.com domain. We will test the replication between these two domain controllers by creating a test Active Directory object and then making sure that both these domain controllers get the same object. Finally, we will join a client, the XP client, to this network so that we have a client-server network in place. And then I'll give you a little tour of Active Directory just to make sure that we check all the components and make sure that these components are working okay. So to begin with, what is Active Directory? Very simply stated, Active Directory is a security database. It is a database because it is a collection of different objects that eventually control the security on our networks. Let's take the analogy of another database that we are very familiar with, a telephone directory. In a telephone directory, you basically track contacts. In other words, you track a person's first name, last name, their telephone number, their address, the cell phone numbers, and then you keep that information in such a way so that you can easily retrieve it. Active Directory is very similar. In the Active Directory, you create users, you put those users into groups, and then eventually you give permissions and create policies for a network. All this is contained within the same directory or within the same database known as Active Directory. Very simply defined, an Active Directory is a security boundary. In other words, once you set up a domain, that domain becomes a security boundary. All the objects in that particular domain will follow the same policies that you set up for that particular network. Now, how does all this relate to networking? Those of you familiar with basic networks, you may recall that there are two different types of networks. You can have a peer-to-peer network in which all the computers are peers of each other. In other words, you can set up a network between Windows 98 computers or between Windows 98 and Windows 2000, or a combination of Windows 98, Windows 2000, and Windows XP. All these three types of operating systems can participate in a network known as peer-to-peer, or also as what Microsoft calls it, a workgroup network, where each of them is a peer. In other words, if you want to set up a user account, you have to go through each of the three computers and set up user accounts over there. If you would like to change somebody's password, you'll have to change the password on all three computers. And last but not the least, one of the biggest restrictions is that if you want to have a number of connections to shares on these computers, you're restricted by a maximum of 10 connections. So peer-to-peer is a good network for a home or a small office, just so that you can share files and printers to get started with. As your network grows, then what you must do is install a server operating system in your network and then set up what is known as a client-server network. In a client-server network, you have your Active Directory database not distributed on each of the computers like in the peer-to-peer networks, but on one or two central computers known as a domain controller. So a domain controller is nothing but a special server in the network that has the Active Directory or the security database installed on it. This database is central to the network. In other words, all the user accounts, all the policies are created on this particular domain controller, and all the other users and the computers in the network get the policy from the centralized database. So now if you would like to change somebody's password, you do not have to visit each computer and change the password. You simply go to the domain controller, change the password. The user can go to any computer in the network and log on and be able to use the network resources simply by logging on just once. So that is what Microsoft visioned with the Active Directory. In fact, they made it completely scalable. Let me take you to another picture over here, which you will see in other videos as well. I'm going to minimize this screen, and here's a network diagram that I've set up over here to demonstrate what is Active Directory and what are the different building components of Active Directory. So let's say that you install your first domain. In our case, we will call that domain benandbrady.com. As in that domain, you can have one or more domain controllers. So in other words, you'll install the first server as a domain controller, and you should always have additional domain controllers for redundancy and for network load balancing. So on one domain, benandbrady.com, you may have more than one domain controller, such as DC1, DC2, and DC3. Now, as this company grows, you can continue to use the same domain, but you may also find a need to install additional domains simply because the policies of these domains will not meet the requirements of the new users and groups that you're going to set up in other areas or in other networks. So taking the example of this company, let's say that benandbrady.com expands, and now they're expanding into Asia as well. What you can do is you can leave the first structure of benandbrady.com as the root of the entire forest, and I'll define the forest in a moment, and then install two other domains, namely child domains. In this case, these child domains happen to be usa.benandbrady.com and asia.benandbrady.com. So all the users in Asia will belong to the benandbrady.com domain in the Asia subdomain, and all the users in USA will belong to the USA's child domain. Now you can tell this is a child domain for two reasons. Number one, it is located underneath this domain to show you that this is a child domain. And number two, look at the name of the domain, usa.benandbrady.com. This usa.benandbrady basically means that the USA is a child domain of benandbrady.com. So you have a domain, you have these child domains, and all these work together as one functional unit. Now, this is a domain. A collection of these three domains in a parent-child manner is also known or referred to as a child domain, and this entire structure of parent and child domains is called an Active Directory tree. Now, you can install additional trees as well. So let's take the example of benandbrady.com going out and acquiring a different company, jackandjill.com. Now, jackandjill.com also had a huge presence in Europe and Canada, and they had child domains Euro and Canada. So you acquired this company. In the days of Windows NT, you had to have two separate entities over here, and there would be trust relationships set up between the first domain, which is benandbrady.com, and the second major domain, which is jackandjill.com. In fact, there were no child domains as well in Windows NT. And these domain trust relationships were very cumbersome to manage. Now what Microsoft has done is the following. What you can do is install jackandjill.com as an additional tree within the same forest as benandbrady.com. In other words, this is one tree, this would be a second tree. So jackandjill.com would be the second tree, and all the domains within it would be the child domains of that second tree. And then a collection of trees would be referred to then as a forest. So here are our building blocks for Active Directory. One of the smallest building blocks is a domain. A collection of domains in a parent-child relationship is known as a tree. You can have several trees in a relationship with each other, and a collection of these trees is referred to as the forest. So these are the building blocks for Active Directory, and this is what makes Active Directory completely scalable. As your network grows, your Active Directory can grow with it. So let me minimize this one more time and go back to our notes over here. So we defined what an Active Directory was, and I gave you some idea as to what a domain is, what a tree is, and what a forest is. Now, what we need to do is go to our first server, which is DC1, and install Active Directory on it by making it a domain controller for our fictitious company, benandbrady.com. So let's do that. I'm going to minimize the screen over here and then make our connection to DC1. So I have these connections open over here in this tab. I'm going to connect to DC1, and I'm into DC1. Once again, you can see it from the name over here and the IP address. Now, to install Active Directory on this domain controller, you need to run a process known as dcpromo. This process is run from the start run button, but before you run the process, you have to make sure that your network is connected and you have static IPs both for the IP configuration or the IP address for the NIC card on DC1 as well as the DNS server. So this is an important step that we had covered in the previous lab. I'm going to cancel this. I have made sure that I have a static IP set up on my network card over here, and my DNS is also set to the IP address of this computer itself. Now I'm ready to install Active Directory on this computer. To install Active Directory, you need to click on Start, go to Run, and then type dcpromo, and then click on the OK button. This starts the installation of what is known as Active Directory, and the wizard will come up. You need to answer the questions of the wizard and then finish the installation in that manner. So I'm going to click on the next button. The first question it's asking me is whether I want to install a domain controller for a new domain, or am I doing an additional domain controller for an existing domain. Well, everything that we're going to do now is brand new. We're going to create a brand new domain, a brand new tree, in fact a brand new forest. So I'm going to keep this selected, click on the next button, and now it's asking me whether I want to create a new domain tree. The answer is yes. Once again, I'm going to click on the next button. Do I want to create a new forest? The answer is yes again. I'll leave that selected. This is where I put the full DNS name for my domain. Over here I'm going to type benandbrady.com for the domain name of our network. I'm going to click on the next button. At this point, it's going to verify whether I have the DNS server present in my network, and it will try to verify for the uniqueness of this name benandbrady.com as well. So make sure your NIC card is connected at this point, otherwise this process will not go through. And then once it finds that I do not have the DNS installed, it will give up on that and then give me the NetBIOS name called benandbrady. Notice the absence of .com over here. This is for backward compatibility with Windows NT computers. Windows NT used NetBIOS names. So here's my NetBIOS name, benandbrady. I'm going to click on the next button. And then over here, it's going to ask me where do I want to install the Active Directory. By default, it goes to the directory where you have installed server. In Server 2000, the folder where the server is installed is called WinNT. And then it puts it's going to create a new folder or a new directory called NTDS. So my Active Directory database will be installed over here. In fact, the name of the file is called ntds.dit once the Active Directory is installed. And it's also going to create a log file over here. Now, one of the popular questions in certification exams is that a lot of times it's a good idea to create the log file on a separate hard disk than the Active Directory database as well. This is because if you have two different hard disks, it is easier to access, or it is more efficient for the system to access two different hard disks simultaneously, so that if your log file and your Active Directory are in two databases or in two different hard disks, I'm sorry about that, not two different databases, but on two different hard disks, the performance actually improves. Please note, it should be two different hard disks, not simply two different partitions on the same hard disk. That will not improve the performance. Click on the next button. Now it's going to tell me that it's going to create a folder called sysvolve on the partition again for me, and this partition must be NTFS5 volume. So we do have NTFS5 set up, and it's going to create a folder called sysvolve on it. Those of you familiar with Windows 2000, there are three different partitions that are supported: FAT or FAT16, FAT32, and NTFS. You can install Server 2000 and have FAT partition at the time of installation. However, before you actually install the Active Directory, you must convert that to NTFS, otherwise this process will not go forward. So I'm going to click on the next button. At this point, it's telling me that it was not able to contact a DNS server, and DNS server is absolutely needed to install Active Directory, because DNS acts as a service locating service for the Active Directory database. So I'm going to click on the OK button, and it's telling me that yes, it's going to go ahead and install and configure the DNS on this computer. So I'm going to leave that on. My CD is inserted, my Server 2000 CD is inserted into the computer because it needs the files to install the DNS for me. I'm going to click on the next button, and now over here it wants to know whether I want permissions that is compatible with pre-Windows 2000 servers or only with Windows 2000. There are a lot of changes between Windows NT and Windows 2000. Remember, Windows 2000 does not know of the existence of Server 2003 because it came out later on. So that's why I'm seeing a screen that shows me compatibility with Windows 2000 and earlier operating systems. Now in our case, it does not matter because we simply have Windows 2000 and Windows XP in our environments. So I can select this, or I can keep it on this. I'm just going to leave it for the default, meaning that if I had a pre-Windows 2000 server on this particular network, it will work fine as well. And then click on the next button. Over here, it's going to ask me for the directory services restore mode password. Let's discuss this a little bit over here. This is not the same password as the administrator's user account's password. This is the password that is needed to restore Active Directory from backup in case you would like to actually restore the Active Directory. In other words, if the Active Directory on this computer gets corrupted, or there is a problem with the Active Directory and you've performed a backup before, if you would like to restore a backup, you need to restart your computer in the advanced options by clicking on the F8 key and then select the directory services restore mode. Once you're in that mode, it's going to ask you for this particular password that we're going to put over here. So please remember, this is not the same as the administrator's password. Over here, I'm going to set up a password called Rainbow. So all lower cases, R-A-I-N-B-O-W. Type that password again, R-A-I-N-B-O-W. Click on the next button. And now it's giving me the summary screen saying that I've selected my domain name to be benandbrady.com, and it's going to set up a NetBIOS name of benandbrady. Click on the next button, and now it's going to start writing the Active Directory on this particular computer as evident by this logo. This process is going to take a few minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the video over here, As soon as this process finishes, we will have to restart a server, and I will join you at that time. The installation of Active Directory just finished, and here I am on the finish button over here. I'm going to click on finish, and then it's going to ask me to restart a server. So when I do that, I'm going to lose the desktop connection for DC1. And then the server, the very first time when a domain controller is created, to reboot it may take several minutes. So what we have done is we have successfully installed Active Directory on our first computer, namely DC1, and this is now a domain controller for the benandbrady.com domain. The next task is then to set up the additional domain controller, which is DC2. So we're going to do that next. This will be a very similar process to what we just did, except this time instead of saying that I would like to set up a new domain and a new forest, I'm simply going to say that I would like to create an additional domain controller for the same forest. Now the process of first we need to make sure that DC1 starts okay before I can actually join DC2 to the network. So this will take a few minutes because the server is going to restart. So I'm going to pause the video one more time. Once DC1 restarts, let's connect to DC1 and look at the changes that were made because of the installation of Active Directory, and then we'll take it from there. You will see that all the labs that are talked about in this video will be performed right in front of you. So a lot of times it is necessary to actually pause the video because some of these tasks can take a considerable amount of time. So I'm going to do the same thing over here. I'm going to take a little pause, and then I'll join you back once DC1 restarts, and then we'll make a connection to DC1 one more time. Well, I'm back. DC1 just restarted, so let's make a connection to DC1, and we will take a small tour of the Active Directory. Once all the other components of the Active Directory, namely client DC2 and client 1 are installed, at that time we will log in and take a full tour of the Active Directory. So let's see what changes were made on this computer, namely DC1, as a result of the installation of Active Directory. So I'm going to double click over here, and let's first right click on the computer object and then go to the properties as soon as it comes up. Also, please note that the first time you boot the server after the domain controller has been installed, even though it may be up and running, there are services that are running in the background, and you will notice that from this point forward, every time you reboot the domain controller, it just takes a little bit longer to reboot. So right click on the computer object DC1 over here, and then go to properties. Alright, here's a general tab, and it says that I've installed Service Pack 4 and I'm on Windows Server 2000, which we knew. Going back to network identification, look at this. My domain is now benandbrady.com, and I'm the domain controller for the domain benandbrady.com. My computer name is DC1, and the full name is, or what is also known as the FQDN, or fully qualified domain name, is dc1.benandbrady.com. Also notice the properties button is now gone. In other words, I cannot change this computer name to something else, or I cannot join or disjoin something else as well. So Active Directory is installed on this domain computer. It becomes a fixed object in the domain database. Now the other thing that you must also know is that in the programs it has created a set of tools called admin tools, and in there were some tools there from before, but now in particular there's a new tool called Active Directory Users and Computers, and this is a tool that is used to actually view your domain database. Perhaps the most commonly used tool in the set of tools that Active Directory has provided us. So here we go. This is the tool, and I'm looking at my domain, namely benandbrady.com, and these are the different objects or the components that make up the domain. What I'm going to do at this point is go to Windows, and I'm sorry, over here under View, and then turn on what is known as the advanced features. So I'm looking at all the sets of objects that are out there. Otherwise, some of the objects are actually hidden from your view. We will take a tour of this later on once I've installed the additional domain controller and the client to our network. But very quickly over here, if I click on the link over here that says domain controllers, you will see that there is one computer sitting out there called DC1, which is in fact the domain controller for the benandbrady.com domain. So that's one thing that you need to observe. And the second thing you need to observe before we continue with our additional domain controller installation is the DNS tool. In the DNS, you will notice that it created a zone in the forward lookup zone for benandbrady.com, and it has registered our first computer 200.200.201 to be the IP address of DC1. So our DNS is now ready to do name resolutions for our network as well. So I'm going to close this program and then minimize the connection to DC1. Now what we will do is make our connection to DC2, and I believe I have a connection open over here. Here we go. And now we're going to make this computer an additional domain controller for benandbrady.com network. Once again, let's double check our TCP/IP settings. Again, extremely important. One of the reasons why some of these labs will go very smoothly is because I would say most of the labs will go smoothly is because the background information was done beforehand, and you've checked these little things like the IP address and the DNS settings and so forth. So here we go. I have the right IP and the DNS settings. I'm going to exit out of this. And now this time also, I have inserted the CD-ROM in the computer, and I'm going to run the DC promo process. This time, I will not explain each and every screens over here. Will be going quickly. Welcome to the wizard. Next, I would like to install the additional domain controller for the existing domain. Next. Now, this is important. You did not see this screen the first time you did DC promo. What this is doing is the following. Because now the domain already exists, it needs the permission of the enterprise domain admin so that I can actually join this particular domain, or rather I can join this computer and make it an additional domain controller for the benandbrady.com domain. Please note, it is not asking me for the local administrator's username and password. It wants the domain admins, or rather the enterprise admins username and password for me to log in. You have to be at least the domain admin to be able to perform this activity, namely joining an additional computer as a domain controller to the domain. So over here again, I'm going to type administrator, and our password happens to be password once again, and the domain is called benandbrady.com. And then click on the next button. This is a critical step. At this point, what it's trying to do is trying to find a domain, and I had to browse it and pick it up in the DNS names. And now when I click on the next button, it will attempt to contact the domain. In fact, it went pretty fast. Sometimes you will notice that it will take it just a little bit longer just so that it can find a domain. Once again, because we did our homework well by setting up the right IPs and making sure the DNS is up and running, it found it very quickly. So going forward, we would like to create a folder NTDS, and the log will be stored in the same folder as well. NTFS volume 5 should be there. It is already there. Again, the password for the restore mode is going to be rainbow. Click on the next button, and then it gives me the summary screen. And now you will see that the logo over here looks a little bit different. Now instead of just showing you this particular logo, it's actually showing you that the information is coming from, there we go, from the Active Directory, from the domain controller that you've set up. So once again, you will see the little balloon go from over here into the network cable to the other side, and then the Active Directory database has been written on this particular server. So what we are doing is setting up we are setting up DC2 as the additional domain controller of this domain. As soon as this process is done, this computer will also restart, and then we'll have two domain controllers and a domain. The last step would be to join a client to our network. So what I'm going to do is take a pause over here, and as soon as this finishes, I will actually restart the server. You will not see that step. I'm just going to do it in the background, and then go ahead and start and show you how to actually install or to join a client to the network. So I'm going to pause the video over here. Now while DC2 is restarting in the background, let's connect to the client computer this time. So I'm on XP over here. If you notice, the connection for DC2 went because it is restarting in the background. And now it's time to join this client to the network. Once again, a good idea to verify the TCP/IP properties. And there we go. The IP address will be 200.11 and the DNS is set to 200.1. So that should do it. And now we're going to join this computer to the network benandbrady.com. To do that, you need to right click on client, go to properties, and then go to the computer name tab. The tabs over here are a little bit different than they are in Windows 2000. So go to the computer name tab, and then over here we can click on, you can actually click on the network ID wizard over here. It will actually start a wizard, ask too many questions. It's very easy to actually click on a change button. In the domain over here, let's type benandbrady.com and then click on the OK button. What we'll try to do is try to contact the domain, and once again it needs the permission of the domain admin to actually join this client computer to the domain, just like before when we did for the DC promo process for DC2. So over here I'm going to type administrator password and then click on the OK button. Now it will actually attempt to contact DC1 and create the computer object for client 1 in the domain database. Once this process is accomplished, once again, this computer will have to be restarted. So DC2 is restarting in the background, and while these are going on, what I'll do is I'll give you a tour of the Active Directory on DC1. This time we'll be able to see all the objects that were created as a result of our network installation. So let's give it a few more minutes, and we should soon see a message box that says welcome to benandbrady.com network. Okay, it's taking a little bit longer than what I expected, but as soon as it comes up, we will click on that button over there and then go on to the next process. In fact, let me tell you about the process a little bit now. What we will do is we will go to Active Directory users and computers, and then over there I'll give you a brief tour of the domain database. We will in particular try to find the objects that were created as part of this installation. So over there, let me start giving you the tour. I don't know how long this is going to take at this point, and we'll come back to the screen as soon as this process is over with. So I'll check on that in a few minutes, but going back to DC1, I'm going to minimize this screen, and over here I'm going to go to Programs and then go to Active Directory Users and Computers, and now it's time to take a tour of the Active Directory. This is a tool that is used to create and to observe objects created in the Active Directory. So here is the first object that was created, benandbrady.com. This is the figure of the or the symbol of the network. In there are different containers. These are the containers created by default. The ones that we are interested in is the first container over the third container over here, called the domain controllers container. All the computer objects for domain controllers will be created over here. So as you can see in the domain controllers container, DC1, and I think I made a mistake in the computer name. I left it as DC. It should have been DC2. We will go back and verify that. But here we go. From now on, this will be DC1, and DC is the additional domain controller of our domain. So these are the two domain controllers in benandbrady.com. All the client computers are listed in the folder called computers over here. So I'm going to click on it, and the client 1 account is still not set up. So we'll have to wait a while, and I'll come back and show you this in a few minutes. And the users by default are created in the users container. In fact, both the users and the groups are created over here by default. At this point, the only user that is usable at this point is the administrator account. The second user that is created by default is the guest account, which is disabled also by default. So, and going back to our talking points over here, after client 1 joins in, we would have a client server network set up with client 1 as a client and DC1 and DC2 being the additional domain controllers of our network. And that should also bring us to the end of this video. Just one more topic that remains is the domain replication process, which actually I can show you right away. So let's go back to DC1. I'm going to minimize this Active Directory user and computer screen just so that if we need to check on that object one more time, we can do so. Now, on a server 2000 domain, such as benandbrady.com, if you have more than one domain controller, each of the domain controllers has a read-write copy of the Active Directory database. In other words, I can go to DC1 or DC2 and create an object, such as a user or computer or OU, and those objects will be sent to all the other domain controllers by means of multi-master replication. And that replication takes place automatically every 15 minutes. Or if you would like to view it yourself and actually push the application, you can use the tool known as Active Directory Sites and Services. So let me start that tool. And I'm going to give you a little tour of this tool at this point. So the tool that is used to actually configure your sites and to make sure that replication is taking place all right is the Active Directory Sites and Services. I'm going to briefly discuss this tool in this particular video. Lab 16 actually extensively talks about the Active Directory Sites and Services tool. We will now expand this container called Sites, and in Sites we should be able to see another folder. Actually, there is a site called the default first site name. This is the default site that is created, and in there is a folder called Servers. Our domain controllers are listed over here. So here are our two domain controllers, and our replication takes place from one to the other and can be controlled from here. What I'm just showing you is not necessary for you to perform at this time, but just to give you an idea, I'm going to click over here, and now it's going to replicate from DC1 to DC, which is actually our second domain controller. So you right click on this and then click on replicate now, and there we go. Active Directory is replicating well too. Okay, so we'll be covering this in much more extensively in a different video, but this is another component I just wanted to make sure that you understand. that after a domain is set up, it's a good idea to actually go to Active Directory users and computers, go to DNS, and go to sites and services, and make sure that your domain is in sync. Now it's time to revisit our client. Let's do that. There we go. Finally, welcome to benandbrady.com. That's always a good sign. Click on OK, and then the computer will restart. The first time we did this, the computer simply hung up. Now going back to DC1, let's check out, that's why I kept this tool minimized, Active Directory users and computers. And now over here, once again, I think the object will finally appear over here once that computer client 1 restarts. So we will check into this later on. Okay, I'm going to close this tool and then go back to our lecture points over here. So in this particular video, we installed, and I talked to you what the Active Directory is. I told you about the different components of the Active Directory, namely the domain, the tree, and the forest. We actually created a new domain, benandbrady.com. The first domain controller is called DC1. The second domain controller is DC2. Actually, the computer name that will appear on the screen from this point on will be just DC, but I'll keep referring to it as DC2. And then we tested the domain replication between the two of them. We also joined our client 1 to the benandbrady.com network, and then we took a little tour of the Active Directory just to make sure the components so far look okay. So I thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope to see you in a different video in Advanced Active Directory.